For thousands of years, the Galactic Council stood as the center of peace and order in the known universe. It was a place where thousands of species gathered, creatures of light, beings made of energy, winged civilizations from gas giants, and those who spoke only through vibration and thought. They came from every corner of the stars to discuss trade, laws, and peace. But even in this vast union of worlds, one species was different: the humans. Humans had arrived late to the stars. They were younger, rougher, and smaller compared to most of the great races. Yet somehow they had earned a seat at the table faster than anyone expected. No one really understood how they managed it. Some said it was luck. Others said it was courage. But most quietly admitted, it was because of their hearts. Humans didn't rule through power. They didn't control the biggest fleets, nor did they have the richest worlds. What made them respected was their strange ability to understand others, to find common ground between enemies who had hated each other for generations. When humans joined the Galactic Council, wars that had lasted centuries finally ended. Border conflicts were resolved. Entire species that had refused to talk for ages began to meet again. It wasn't because humans were stronger. It was because somehow they made everyone believe peace was still possible. For a long time, the Council saw humanity as a blessing. But as years turned into centuries, that admiration started to fade. The humans had a way of asking questions no one else dared to ask. When the Council made decisions that benefited powerful empires while hurting smaller species, the humans objected. When the Council signed treaties that protected wealth more than life, the humans protested. They refused to stay silent. To many, that made them heroes. To others, it made them troublemakers. The Council's Grand Hall was a massive structure built inside a hollowed asteroid, surrounded by the light of 3 suns. Inside, thousands of delegates sat in rings that spiraled upward, each level representing a different cluster of worlds. The humans had one of the smallest sections, only a few dozen seats, but their presence was always felt. During meetings, when the air was filled with technical jargon and political half-truths, it was often a human who broke the silence and said something simple, something honest, something that cut through all the noise. And that honesty was what many feared. Among the Council, there was a quiet rule: never question the system too loudly. It had kept peace for centuries, but it was peace built on compromise, and sometimes injustice. Humanity didn't see peace that way. For them, peace meant fairness. It meant truth. And that difference, small as it seemed, began to shake the foundations of the Galactic Council. At first, the disagreements were small: a trade regulation here, a military sanction there. But the pattern grew. Whenever the Council proposed something that put profit or control above morality, the humans voted against it. Even when every other species voted yes. Over time, the humans became known for their stubbornness. In whispered conversations between alien diplomats, they were called the conscience of the Council. And though it sounded like a compliment, not everyone meant it kindly. Some believed humanity's moral stance was a mask for arrogance, that they thought they knew better than everyone else. They act like they're the universe's teachers, one delegate once said. But they forget they've only been here for a few centuries. Yet deep down, many others quietly admired them. Because while everyone else obeyed the unspoken rule of silence, the humans still spoke their truth. In the middle of the Council's capital world, a planet-sized city known as Valar Prime, stood the Hall of Voices, the oldest and most sacred chamber in the galaxy. Every race had contributed something to its creation: stone from ancient worlds, crystals that sang when touched, and air from the first planet ever to join the Council. It was there that humanity first made its mark. The human representative stood in that chamber on their first day, a single person surrounded by thousands of alien forms, and spoke a sentence that became a legend. "We didn't come here to rule. We came here to listen, to learn, and to remind everyone that life, no matter its shape, has worth." That line had once been engraved above their section in the chamber. Delegates would pass by and nod in respect. But now, centuries later, many walked by it without even looking. The times had changed. The Council had grown vast, powerful, and efficient, but it had also grown colder. Decisions were made faster, but empathy was slower. The idea of moral debate was replaced by numbers and votes. The humans could see it happening, and it broke their hearts. They sent warnings, letters, and public addresses, not to accuse but to awaken. They reminded the council that power without compassion leads to emptiness. But those words no longer found listening ears. To the council's elders, humanity's idealism was seen as outdated. The universe is too large, one senior member said during a meeting. We cannot save everyone. The human delegate's answer was quiet but firm. Then what is the point of leading anyone? That silence that followed was heavier than any weapon. Behind closed doors, other members began to whisper. The humans were too emotional, too unpredictable. Some even suggested removing them from the council altogether, but no one dared to make it official, not yet. Despite the tension, humans continued to serve in peace missions. They negotiated truces between warring colonies, opened shelters for refugee species, and repaired damaged worlds. Even when they were ignored in the council chambers, they never stopped trying to help. Many aliens still trusted them, sometimes more than they trusted their own leaders. In one distant system, a colony under threat of collapse once sent a simple transmission. If the council will not answer, maybe the humans will. Messages like that were common, and though humanity could not solve every problem, they always tried. But what they didn't realize was that their compassion was slowly becoming a threat to those who ruled through control. In the high chambers of Valar Prime, whispers of discontent turned into strategy meetings. The more the humans opposed the council's darker agendas, the more they were seen as obstacles, and so plans began to form. Plans that would test humanity's loyalty, patience, and principles. At the same time, within the human delegation, something was changing too. For the first time, humanity began to question whether the council truly represented peace anymore. They had come with open hands and hopeful hearts, believing that unity among the stars meant justice for all. But now it felt like they were standing inside a golden cage. Beautiful, shining, but hollow. In the evenings, after long council sessions, the human delegates would sit by the observation decks and look out at the stars. The galaxy stretched endlessly, filled with color and motion, yet all they could feel was distance. They began to wonder, had they made a mistake by staying? Still, despite everything, they stayed loyal. They believed that even if one voice could make a difference, it was worth it. And so they continued to speak even when no one wanted to listen. There was a certain quiet strength in their persistence, a strength that came not from power, but from faith. Faith that one day, the council would remember why it existed. Faith that peace didn't need to come at the cost of compassion. Faith that maybe, just maybe in the universe still, had room for humanity's stubborn hope, but destiny had other plans because, somewhere in the far edges of the council's control, a crisis was forming, one that would soon force humanity to make the hardest decision of their history. And when that day came, it would shake the stars themselves, because the day humans would finally walk away from the council would be the day the universe changed forever. The meeting that changed everything started like any other. The Galactic Council chamber glowed with its usual golden light. Thousands of representatives sat in perfect circles, each wearing the mark of their species. Their faces were calm, their voices polite, their words practiced. Outside, the stars looked peaceful, as if the universe itself believed the council could never fall. But that day, something was different. Rumors had already spread across the halls before the meeting began. A new decree was being proposed, something called the Varnak Decree. No one really understood what it meant at first, but whispers traveled fast. Some said it was about saving resources. Others said it was about relocating a species from a dying planet. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. It was going to be controversial. When the session started, the council's high speaker rose from the center platform. His voice, deep and echoing, carried through the chamber as he read the proposal. He spoke about efficiency, about the need to maintain balance across the stars. He spoke about how certain species had lived too long on worlds that could no longer support life. He said it was time to make a difficult but necessary choice. Then came the true line that made everyone turn their heads. The council shall relocate the Varnak population to serve in resource extraction colonies across the neutral sectors. Their relocation will ensure stability and productivity for the greater good. The room went silent. Everyone understood what that meant. It wasn't relocation. It was removal. The Varnak were a small, quiet species who lived on a red desert world. Their planet was dying, yes, but they were still alive, still building, still hoping to survive. To the Council, they were a burden. To humanity, they were people. The vote began. Each delegation raised its lighted emblem one by one. The larger, wealthier empires voted yes. They called it a practical decision. The traders and technocrats voted yes. They called it resource management. Even some peaceful worlds voted yes, whispering that it was better than extinction. When it came time for humanity's turn, the hall was already half decided. Almost everyone had voted in favor. The result was clear before the humans even spoke. Still, the human representative stood up slowly, calm but firm. He looked around the chamber, thousands of eyes on him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He just said words that made everyone lean forward. "We vote no." There was a pause. The High Speaker blinked in disbelief. "No?" he repeated. "No," the human said again. "You call this relocation, but what you are really doing is choosing who deserves to survive." The hall filled with whispers. Some were shocked, some annoyed. A few even laughed quietly, as if humanity was being dramatic again. But the human continued. "We cannot support a law that treats life as numbers. If the Varnak need help, then help them. If they need worlds, then give them worlds. But we will not vote for a decision that moves people like cargo." The silence after those words was heavy. For a moment, no one moved. Then one delegate from a wealthy empire leaned forward and said in a cold voice, "Humanity still believes in old fairy tales. Compassion, morality, equality. Those ideas slow progress. The Council cannot afford sentiment." The human replied quietly, "Then maybe progress has gone in the wrong direction." It wasn't an argument. It was a truth that hit the room like a wave. Some delegates looked away. Others stared in anger. The High Speaker, trying to maintain control, announced that the vote would proceed regardless. The results appeared in the air, glowing blue numbers spinning in the chamber's center. Every major power. Yes, every neutral system. Yes, every trading alliance. Yes, and finally, humanity, no one red light among thousands of blue. It should have been small. It should have been meaningless. But somehow that single red light burned brighter than all the others combined. Because in that moment, everyone realized humanity was not afraid to stand alone. The meeting ended in uneasy silence. Delegates avoided eye contact as they left the chamber. The human delegation stayed seated long after everyone was gone, their minds heavy with what they had witnessed. Outside, the Council's banners still waved proudly under the artificial light, but something inside had changed. News of humanity's refusal spread across the galaxy within hours. Some worlds called them heroes, others called them fools. A few powerful empires accused them of rebellion, but everywhere people talked. The word human once again meant something unpredictable, something defiant. Back on Earth's embassy station, the human representatives gathered to discuss what would happen next. They were tired but not regretful. They had voted with conscience, not calculation, yet they all knew the cost that would follow. The Council didn't like disobedience, especially not from a species that had once been praised for its cooperation. In the days that followed, messages arrived from other species, private ones, secret ones. Some said thank you, others said be careful, a few said, "You've made enemies." The human delegation replied to all of them with the same calm message. Peace is meaningless if we forget what it stands for. Weeks passed, and the decree was enforced anyway. The Varnak were moved from their homeworld. The Council reported it as a successful humanitarian mission. Official broadcasts showed shining ships, smiling officials, and statistics about population efficiency. But behind those numbers, something darker lingered. A quiet guilt that spread across the stars. The truth was known even if no one spoke it aloud, and through it all humanity stayed silent, not because they were afraid, but because they were disappointed. They had believed in the Council. They had believed that this great gathering of civilizations represented something higher, something noble, but now they had seen its heart, and it wasn't pure. For the first time in centuries, humanity began to ask a painful question. What if we no longer belong here? Other delegations noticed the change. Humans stopped joining some of the smaller committees. Their ambassadors withdrew from a few joint programs. Even their ships, which once carried aid across galaxies, began to return home more often. At first, everyone thought it was temporary. But then a new pattern began. Whenever the Council passed a decision that went against their principles, the humans simply abstained. They refused to endorse or participate in anything that harmed life, and slowly something strange began to happen. The Council, which had always been sure of itself, started to feel uneasy, because even though humanity's voice was small, it carried weight. Every time they spoke, it reminded others what the Council was supposed to be. Their silence too began to hurt, because when humans stopped believing, others started doubting. In the quiet of space, human ships drifted farther from the Council's central worlds. Some said they were building new colonies, places untouched by politics. Others believed they were creating something bigger, a new kind of alliance based on trust, not control. Inside the Council, tension grew. The High Speaker called for private talks with the human delegation. He asked them to reconsider their negative influence. The humans listened respectfully but refused to apologize. They said only this: "We didn't come here to make enemies. We came to remind the galaxy what peace really means. If that's a problem, maybe the problem isn't us." That line echoed across 1,000 worlds. It was replayed on news networks, quoted in universities, whispered in marketplaces. For many ordinary beings across the galaxy, it became a symbol of courage, a reminder that even one voice can stand against a crowd. But for the Council's leaders, it was something else, a warning. Behind closed doors, discussions turned to frustration. Some accused humanity of dividing the Council. Others said they were becoming dangerous. The words disobedient and unreliable appeared in official reports. What they didn't realize was that humanity wasn't planning rebellion. They were preparing to walk away. And deep down, even the Council's elders knew what that would mean. Humanity's departure would not just be symbolic. It would shake the unity that held the galaxy together, because while other species had strength, only humans had the strange power to connect hearts. It was the beginning of an ending no one wanted to admit. The Varnak Decree had been just one vote among thousands, but it became a moment written in history. The day the Council chose control over compassion, and humanity chose conscience over comfort. From that moment, nothing was the same again. The galaxy had taken its first step toward division, and humanity had taken its first step toward freedom. The quiet war of ideals had begun, not with weapons, but with a word, and that word was no. The days following the Varnak Decree were tense. Humanity had voted against the Council, spoken its conscience, and reminded the galaxy that life could not be measured in efficiency or numbers. Yet the Council had ignored them. The human delegation began to realize that staying would only make them part of a system they no longer respected. For centuries, humanity had worked inside the Council, using diplomacy, compromise, and honesty to protect the weak, to mediate conflicts, to remind everyone that morality mattered. But the Varnak decision had shown them a truth they could no longer ignore. The Council's power had become more important than life itself. Within the human embassy, the delegation met in the observation hall, a space that overlooked the stars. Ships passed in silent lines, trading vessels and Council transports alike, all carrying out the decisions humanity had once believed were just. The humans stood quietly watching, their faces solemn. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. The weight of the choice before them was clear. They could leave, walk away, withdraw from a system that had stopped listening. And if they did, the Council would feel it immediately. Humanity was one of the few species capable of uniting worlds, calming conflicts, reminding others of empathy. Without them, the galaxy would begin to fracture, and perhaps that was exactly what it needed to see. When the lead representative finally spoke, their voice was calm, but it carried a firm resolve. "We've given the Council our best. We've tried to protect life, to mediate, to speak truth, but the system is broken. If we stay, we become complicit. If we leave, perhaps the universe will remember why we mattered in the first place." No one disagreed. The departure began quietly. Ships were prepared in orbit, not as an act of aggression, but as a statement of principle. Humanity would not fight. They would not threaten. They would simply step away. Every vessel carried civilians, aid supplies, and ambassadors. The largest ships, once symbols of human protection, now bore a different message. We will not serve a council that ignores life. News of their departure spread like wildfire. Across the stars, beings watched the human fleets leave council space. Some cheered. Many feared what would come next. And the council itself was stunned. The chambers of Valar Prime were filled with delegates who could not understand the humans' decision. Whispers turned into debates and debates into panic. No species had ever walked away from the council before. Humanity was young, smaller, and relatively powerless in raw numbers, yet their influence had always been unmatched. Now that influence was leaving. For a brief moment it seemed the entire galaxy held its breath. As the human ships passed the council's central worlds, no alarms were raised. No fleets were sent to stop them. Humanity had made a deliberate choice. This was not a rebellion. They would not fight. They would not retaliate. Their departure was a moral stance, not a military one. Yet even without a battle, the effect was immediate. Trade routes slowed. Negotiations stalled. Many smaller species who had relied on human intervention in disputes began to question what to do. Borders once secured by diplomacy were now uncertain. Old conflicts held in check for decades began to flare quietly. On board the largest human ship, the observation deck offered a panoramic view of the departing stars. The lead representative stood silently, watching. They could see the council world shrinking in the distance, their golden lights fading. And with those lights, the human representative felt the weight of what had been left behind. Allies, enemies, and countless lives that would now struggle without human guidance. The crew around them moved efficiently, but there was an unspoken heaviness in the air. They had chosen this path knowing it would bring difficulty. They had chosen it knowing the galaxy would stumble in their absence. And yet in their hearts they felt relief. Relief that they were no longer part of a system that compromised life for efficiency. Stories began to emerge across the stars. News broadcasts, private messages, and personal journals all recounted the human departure. Some civilizations saw humanity as heroes, the moral compass the galaxy had lost. Others saw them as reckless, abandoning responsibilities when the universe needed them most. And the council? Its leaders struggled to regain composure, to explain the unexplainable, that a species could leave not in anger, but in principle. The human delegation sent one final message to the council, not as a threat but as a statement. We do not abandon the galaxy. We abandon a system that has forgotten what it is meant to protect. We hope that one day you will remember the value of life over power. The message was simple. It carried no aggression. And yet, it shook the council more than any war ever could. As the days turned into weeks, humanity's colonies and outposts began to distance themselves from council jurisdiction. New settlements were established on worlds that had once been ignored. Trade agreements were made directly with smaller civilizations. Aid was offered to worlds suffering from neglect. Humanity had not disappeared. They had simply moved to a place where their principles could guide action without compromise. The effect on the galaxy was noticeable. Without human mediation, conflicts arose more easily. Trade disputes escalated. Alliances that had relied on human influence began to falter. For centuries, the Council had counted on humanity's unpredictability to balance politics, to remind others of ethics and compassion. Now that balance was gone. Within the human delegation, life continued quietly. Work was done. New colonies were managed. Resources were allocated to support emerging civilizations in need. And always the thought of the Council lingered, a reminder of why they had chosen this path. Yet there was hope. Humanity had shown the universe that principles could matter more than obedience, that sometimes leaving a system that compromises morality is more powerful than remaining silent. Stories spread across the stars. Children in distant worlds read of humanity's courage, scholars debated their moral choices, and leaders reconsidered policies they had once taken for granted. For the first time, the idea of leaving the Council was no longer unthinkable. Humanity had opened a door that others had been afraid to see. Even as human ships drifted farther from Council space, the universe could not forget them. Every movement, every decision, every aid mission broadcast across communication networks reminded the galaxy that life was more important than bureaucracy. And while the Council tried to maintain its image of stability, inside fear had begun to grow. What would happen if other species followed humanity's example? What would happen if more voices refused to obey? And most importantly, could the council survive without the humans who had always been its conscience? In silence, the human fleet traveled onward, leaving the council behind. They did not celebrate. They did not gloat. They simply moved forward, guided by principles and purpose, hoping that in time, the galaxy would understand the meaning of their departure. The stars themselves seemed to acknowledge the change. Systems once quiet now buzzed with uncertainty. Borders shifted. Disputes quietly emerged. But there was also a subtle hope, a reminder that action guided by conscience could ripple farther than power alone ever could. And somewhere deep in the heart of every human representative, a quiet thought persisted. We leave not because we hate, but because we care too much to stay silent. The departure was not the end. It was a beginning, a declaration that humanity would not bend to systems that valued control over life. And it was a lesson to the universe, that sometimes leaving is the strongest choice of all. The day humanity left the Galactic Council was not marked by war nor by chaos. It was marked by a quiet, deliberate step into the unknown, a step that would echo across generations not as a failure, but as a testament to courage, principle, and the power of one species to remind the universe of what truly matters. Even as council worlds receded into the distance, every human on every ship knew the truth. The universe had changed, and someday perhaps it would remember why. The universe fell into a strange quiet after humanity left the Galactic Council. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was heavier, more uncertain, a silence that carried questions no one knew how to answer. Trade routes slowed, negotiations stalled, and systems that had relied on human guidance began to feel unsteady. The galaxy was still spinning, stars still shone, and worlds still thrived. Yet beneath that beauty, there was a sense of imbalance that could not be ignored. For centuries, humans had been the bridge between civilizations. They had mediated disputes, resolved conflicts, and reminded others that empathy was stronger than fear. Even when they had been ignored, even when their voices had gone unheard, their presence had been a stabilizing force. Now that presence was gone, and the universe felt it. Many smaller civilizations had depended on humanity's diplomacy to survive. They had known that even if they were overlooked by the Council, humans would hear their stories, advocate for them, and find a solution. But with the human fleet gone, these worlds suddenly felt exposed. The protections that humans had offered were no longer there. In some regions, old disagreements that had long been kept in check began to resurface. Borders once respected were now challenged. Trade routes that had been carefully negotiated became sources of tension. And although no one wanted war, the galaxy was beginning to experience the effects of humanity's absence. The Council itself struggled. At first, it tried to act as if nothing had changed. Meetings continued, decisions were made, and resolutions were passed. But behind closed doors, a sense of panic spread. How could a species so young, so comparatively small, have held so much influence over the stability of the galaxy? And now, with humans gone, what could replace that influence? The Council's leaders attempted to compensate. They called emergency sessions, increased surveillance, and reminded everyone that the laws of the galaxy were still in place. But laws without enforcement or empathy were not enough. The balance that had existed with humanity present was fragile, and now cracks were appearing. In the far reaches of space, colonies that had once relied on human mediation began to communicate with each other nervously. Messages traveled more slowly, sometimes days or weeks longer than before, and each delay created new uncertainty. Disputes that had once been settled calmly now festered. Small disagreements escalated because there was no longer a trusted neutral party to intervene. The absence of humans was felt most by those who had once depended on them for moral guidance. Scientists who had shared resources, engineers who had collaborated across species, and diplomats who had relied on human negotiation skills all began to feel the gap. They noticed how quickly misunderstandings could turn into resentment, and how fragile peace really was without someone to remind everyone of the bigger picture. Yet even as problems grew, humanity was not idle. Far from the Council's reach, human settlements continued to expand. They offered aid to worlds that had been overlooked, repaired damaged infrastructure, and provided support to civilizations struggling with environmental collapse or political unrest. In their absence, humanity demonstrated A different kind of power, the power of constructive, action without coercion, stories, began to circulate across the galaxy about human settlements helping species that had once been ignored. Food shipments reached worlds in famine. Medical supplies were sent to planets facing epidemics. Scientific knowledge was shared freely, allowing smaller civilizations to grow stronger and more self-sufficient. Even though humans had left the Council, they continued to influence the universe in meaningful ways. Meanwhile, the Council became aware of the cost of losing their conscience. Political debates grew longer and more contentious. Trade agreements that had previously been straightforward became tangled in disputes. Alliances that had once been stable now faced tensions. The Council had thought it could manage without humans, but every decision now carried greater uncertainty, and every failure reminded them of what had been lost. Alien leaders began to realize that the humans' absence was more than symbolic. Humans had not been powerful in the traditional sense. They had not dominated others with military might or economic control. Their strength had been moral influence, and without that guiding force, the galaxy felt disoriented. Leaders who had once relied on human diplomacy found themselves struggling to maintain agreements, while ordinary citizens began questioning whether the Council was capable of fairness. Across countless worlds, the public's reaction varied. Some celebrated humanity's stand, seeing them as moral heroes. Others feared the growing instability. And in quiet corners of the galaxy, some began to wonder whether they had relied too much on humans for guidance. Had humanity been carrying the weight of the galaxy without anyone realizing it? For the human delegation, watching from their settlements, it was a mix of satisfaction and concern. They had left to protect their principles, to avoid complicity in decisions that harmed life, and yet they knew the universe would struggle without them. Their departure was a statement, yes, but it came with responsibility. They could not simply walk away and ignore what happened next. They began working differently. Instead of participating in council politics, they focused on direct assistance. They traveled to worlds in need, facilitated collaborations between smaller species, and shared knowledge without expecting obedience. Their goal was simple: prove that a society could thrive without compromising ethics. News of human activity traveled faster than any council broadcast. Across the galaxy, beings began to hear reports of humans quietly helping worlds without demanding recognition or power. Unlike the council's decisions, these actions did not seek applause or enforcement. They were acts of genuine care, and that sincerity carried weight. It became clear to many that humanity's departure had not weakened the universe. It had created a new, different kind of influence. The Council, for all its authority, could enforce laws. But humanity, by acting according to principle rather than authority, inspired loyalty and trust in ways the Council never could. At the same time, some species struggled to adapt. Worlds that had relied heavily on human guidance faced challenges in maintaining stability. Negotiations that had once been simple became complicated. Trade disputes escalated into political arguments, and some planets, unaccustomed to dealing with issues without human intervention, found themselves in difficult positions. This period came to be known as the Age of Silence. It was not marked by war nor by dramatic catastrophe. It was quieter, subtler, but deeply significant. The absence of humanity created gaps that revealed how fragile the galaxy had been under the surface. For humans, it was a time of reflection. They watched the universe struggle, but they also saw potential. Without their interference in council politics, species had to learn to solve problems themselves. The humans offered tools and guidance, but they allowed others to make their own choices. It was a deliberate test, to see if civilizations could survive, grow, and thrive without someone constantly mediating. And slowly, changes began to appear. Some worlds rose to the challenge, learning negotiation, compromise, and problem-solving. Others struggled, clinging to the familiar structures left behind by the Council. But even failures were instructive. The galaxy was learning that power without conscience led to instability, and that morality, not enforcement, was the strongest glue for lasting peace. The Council, meanwhile, could no longer ignore the truth. Humanity's absence was a lesson in itself. The leaders began to see that without human guidance, every decision carried more risk. They felt the vacuum of influence left behind, and with each passing cycle, they realized how much they had relied on a species that had never sought control, only fairness. Across human settlements, leaders discussed the lessons they had hoped the galaxy would learn. They did not seek to return immediately. They understood the power of absence, how walking away could teach more than staying and arguing. And yet they also knew that time alone would not fix the Council's mistakes. The universe needed reminders, not punishments. It needed principles, not authority. In quiet moments, human representatives reflected on their journey. Leaving the Council had been difficult but necessary. The galaxy was adjusting. Change was slow and uneven, but it was happening. Worlds were waking up to their own responsibilities. Species were learning the cost of compromise without conscience, and somewhere in that process hope persisted, fragile but undeniable. The aftermath of their departure became a story told across generations. Children on countless planets heard tales of the humans who refused to obey injustice. Scholars debated the lessons of the Age of Silence. Leaders reconsidered decisions they had once thought trivial. And the Council, now aware of its own limits, began to question whether power alone was enough to maintain order. Humanity had left the halls of Valor Prime, but their influence had not vanished. It had simply transformed. Instead of guiding from within, they inspired from afar. Instead of enforcing, they nurtured. Instead of commanding, they led by example. The shadows left by their absence were long, but they revealed something critical. Even the smallest species, guided by principles, could change the course of the universe. Even a departure, when done with integrity, could reshape history, and so the fee. The years following humanity's departure from the Galactic Council were not marked by fireworks or dramatic battles, but by a quiet reckoning. The universe began to feel the absence of a species that had always been the voice of conscience, the bridge between civilizations, and the reminder that morality mattered more than rules or power. Slowly, subtly, the effects rippled across countless worlds. At first, many civilizations barely noticed the difference. Trade continued, agreements were signed, and life seemed to go on. But in the shadows, tensions began to rise. Borders that had been carefully maintained for decades started to fray. Disputes that humans once mediated quietly began to escalate. Small conflicts, once resolved with diplomacy, now lingered and festered. In the Council's chambers, the absence of the human delegation was immediately felt. For centuries, humans had been a moral anchor, not because they wielded force or wealth, but because they had a unique ability to remind others of fairness, empathy, and justice. Now the chambers felt emptier. Decisions that would once have been questioned, debated, or moderated by humans were passed quickly, often with consequences no one fully anticipated. Alien diplomats whispered among themselves. They began to see how much they had relied on human guidance, without humans to challenge them, to ask difficult questions, and to remind them of consequences. They realized the Council's decisions were being made in a vacuum. The galaxy had become louder but less wise. Far from the Council's center, ordinary beings on countless worlds felt the impact in smaller, more personal ways. Farmers found their trade agreements delayed, leading to shortages in some regions. Engineers struggled to get access to technologies that had previously been shared through human channels. Scientists, previously able to collaborate across species thanks to human mediation, now faced bureaucratic obstacles that slowed progress. Life had not stopped, but it had become harder, and people everywhere sensed it. Even those who had opposed humanity's moral stances began to feel unease. The empires and alliances that had once celebrated the Varnak Decree and other controversial decisions soon discovered that power without conscience carried costs. Conflicts escalated unexpectedly. Agreements that seemed solid unraveled. And in moments of crisis, there was no human presence to calm tempers or remind leaders of the stakes beyond immediate gain. The ripple effect was felt in regions of space that had once been peaceful. Mining colonies, trade hubs, and border worlds began to experience tension. Civil disputes that had been minor became significant because there was no neutral voice to mediate. Without humans, even small decisions became fraught with uncertainty. Leaders struggled to negotiate without an impartial presence. And as challenges multiplied, the true impact of humanity's absence became clear. They had not merely left a political council, they had left a moral vacuum. Meanwhile, humans themselves continued their work quietly, far from the council. They traveled between worlds that had been neglected, offering assistance without interference. They provided food, medical aid, and technology, but they did not demand recognition or compliance. They shared knowledge and supported emerging civilizations, allowing these worlds to make their own choices. The humans had chosen a different kind of influence, one rooted in principle rather than authority, guidance rather than command. As their presence spread indirectly, the galaxy began to take notice. Messages arrived from grateful civilizations. Species who had once been ignored by the Council now had access to resources, knowledge, and protection because of humanity's actions. Word of humans helping without seeking power or praise traveled faster than any Council broadcast. Stories circulated about humans quietly helping worlds in need, proving that ethical action could shape the galaxy more profoundly than rules or decrees ever could. But even as humans offered aid, the universe continued to struggle without them in the Council. The major powers, accustomed to relying on human intervention, began to clash. Trade routes slowed as disagreements escalated. Alliances strained as leaders discovered that agreements enforced without conscience were fragile. Wars did not erupt immediately, but disputes simmered, ready to ignite. The Council, once confident in its ability to govern, began to feel the weight of absence. Meetings became more chaotic, decisions more controversial. Leaders found themselves questioning their choices in a way they had never done when humans had been present. The Council had always assumed it could operate without moral oversight, but now the cost of that assumption became painfully clear. Ordinary citizens across the galaxy began to notice the change too. They had always trusted humans as mediators and advocates, even when humans were just one voice among many. Now, without that guiding presence, frustration grew. People began to question the fairness of decisions, the motivations of leaders, and the effectiveness of the Council itself. Trust, once abundant, began to erode. In this growing instability, humans observed carefully. They did not intervene in the Council's politics directly, but they offered indirect guidance to worlds in need. They trained diplomats, shared knowledge, and encouraged civilizations to develop their own capacity for negotiation and compromise. Humanity's approach was deliberate. They wanted to demonstrate that morality could guide action even without formal authority. Yet, as they helped from afar, the humans could not ignore the suffering that emerged from the Council's mistakes. Small conflicts escalated into regional tensions. Economies faltered when trade agreements collapsed. Border disputes flared between species who had relied on human mediation for decades. And in each case, it became clear that the absence of a moral voice, even one that never wielded force, carried consequences that the galaxy could not yet fully understand. Across systems, news networks and communications carried the growing realization: humanity's absence was being felt everywhere. Leaders who had ignored ethical guidance began to wonder if the humans had been the real stabilizers of the galaxy. Scholars debated the consequences of their departure, and ordinary citizens watching events unfold began to appreciate the quiet influence humans had always had. In some regions, the human absence inspired reflection. Civilizations that had once followed rules blindly began to examine their own values. They questioned decisions made in the name of efficiency or profit. Slowly, some species began to realize that morality mattered, not because humans were present to enforce it, but because their absence highlighted the consequences of ignoring it. Meanwhile, humans continued their work quietly. They traveled to worlds that had been overlooked by the Council, offering resources, knowledge, and encouragement. They trained local leaders, supported communities, and facilitated connections between civilizations that had once been isolated. Their influence grew in subtle ways, reminding the galaxy that action guided by principle could achieve more than rules enforced without conscience. Even as the Council struggled, humans remained focused on their purpose. They understood that the challenges faced by the galaxy were not a result of power alone, but of leadership without empathy. Their absence had created a vacuum, but it had also created opportunities for growth, reflection, and learning. The reckoning continued. Conflicts persisted, but in the shadows, new leaders emerged. Species who had never led before began to take responsibility for their own futures. Decisions that had once relied on human mediation were now made with courage, debate, and compromise. Slowly, civilizations began to adapt to the absence, learning lessons that humans had long hoped they would understand. Yet even as they learned, The consequences of ignoring humanity were clear. The galaxy was no longer stable in the way it had been. There was tension, uncertainty, and the reminder that ethics and conscience could not be replaced by rules or authority alone. Humanity's absence was a lesson that the galaxy could not forget, a lesson written not in conflict, but in quiet, far-reaching consequences. The human fleet, scattered across countless worlds, continued to act with integrity and patience. They did not intervene in disputes unless invited. They did not enforce rules. They offered guidance, knowledge, and support. Their goal was not to dominate or control, but to show that moral action could guide civilizations toward stability, even when formal authority failed. In time, a quiet balance began to emerge. Some regions remained unstable, but others thrived under new leadership and the indirect influence of humans. The galaxy began to understand a simple truth. Moral guidance could be as powerful as any fleet or army. Principles, when applied consistently and patiently, had the capacity to shape civilizations and inspire cooperation, even in the absence of formal power. And so, the universe continued, shaped by the quiet absence of humans from the Council. The reckoning was not dramatic but profound. It revealed the fragility of power without conscience, the necessity of ethical leadership, and the true influence of a species guided by principles rather than authority. The galaxy had learned a lesson it could not ignore. The absence of humans had been felt everywhere, in every decision, every conflict, and every negotiation. It had shown that even one species, acting with integrity and patience, could leave a mark far greater than any formal decree or fleet ever could. And the humans themselves, watching from afar, knew that their choice to step away had been necessary. Time moved differently in the galaxy once humanity had left the Council. For decades, civilizations struggled, learned, and adapted to the absence of the species that had once been the conscience of the universe. Borders shifted, old conflicts flared, and new leaders emerged from unexpected places. The galaxy felt both fragile and alive, as though it were testing itself in humanity's absence. But humans did not stay hidden forever. Their return was not sudden or dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and purposeful. They did not march in with fleets of warships or demand the attention of the Council. Instead, they moved from world to world, unseen but deeply felt, offering guidance, aid, and connection where it was most needed. They had learned long ago that influence did not come from power but from principle. Their first actions were small but meaningful. On distant planets that had once depended on human mediation, trade routes were re-established through local cooperation, encouraged by human advisors who worked behind the scenes. Water purification systems were repaired on arid worlds. Educational programs were set up to teach the younger generation the importance of empathy and critical thinking. The humans did not intervene directly in politics. They provided tools, guidance, and hope. And yet, even without appearing in the council chambers, the humans' presence began to shift the galaxy. Leaders who had once relied solely on authority now sought advice from the human emissaries. Civilizations that had struggled in isolation began to collaborate, sharing resources and knowledge to solve common problems. Slowly, the moral compass of the universe began to recalibrate, not because humans commanded it to, but because they reminded others of what leadership could be. The Council noticed. For the first time in decades, the Chamber felt the weight of human absence and the quiet power of their influence returning. Decisions were scrutinized more carefully. Debates grew longer, and some leaders hesitated to act rashly. They realized that humans did not need to be present in the halls to affect outcomes. Their principles had already woven themselves into the fabric of countless worlds. Humans had also begun to focus on communication. They shared stories of cooperation and problem-solving with civilizations that had been neglected. They encouraged dialogue where there had been silence, and trust where there had been suspicion. In this way, they rebuilt connections not with force but with understanding. Their approach was subtle, yet the effects were undeniable. Across the galaxy, beings began to notice the change. Trade agreements were honored more faithfully. Border disputes, once escalating quickly, were now resolved through discussion and compromise. Communities that had previously been ignored by the Council found that they could thrive when given support rather than orders. And everywhere the idea spread that morality, principle, and compassion were powerful tools for survival and growth. Even the Council could not ignore these effects. Leaders began to reassess decisions made in the past. They realized that humanity's absence had taught them lessons they could not have understood otherwise. The galaxy had struggled, but it had also adapted, learned, and grown. Humans had returned not to take control, but to help the universe recognize its own potential. In their quiet way, humans also began to rebuild trust with civilizations that had lost hope. Refugee worlds previously neglected by the Council found assistance in establishing stable settlements. Scientists shared discoveries freely, enabling technological and medical advancements in areas previously cut off from progress. The humans had shown that leadership could be ethical, patient, and supportive, a lesson the galaxy was eager to learn. The return of humans was not marked by celebration or fanfare. It was observed through the subtle, steady changes they inspired. Their ships appeared in orbit, not as a show of force but as a reminder of principle. Their advisors met with local leaders privately, helping them resolve disputes and manage resources. They repaired systems, supported communities, and taught collaboration. The message was clear. Humans were not coming to rule, but to guide. Civilizations across the galaxy began to notice a remarkable thing. Problems that had seemed impossible to solve without humans were now being addressed through cooperation. The knowledge and methods humans shared allowed worlds to solve disputes themselves. This independence was perhaps the greatest gift humanity could offer. The ability to thrive without direct intervention, guided by principles instead of fear or obedience. Even the Council slowly came to understand this new dynamic. Humans had returned, yet not to reclaim a seat of power. They were not enforcing laws or issuing commands. Instead, they demonstrated a model of influence based on wisdom, patience, and ethics. The Council recognized that this approach was powerful in ways their authority could never match. Over time, the galaxy began to see stability return, not through control, but through understanding. Borders became less contentious. Trade resumed with honesty and fairness. Collaborative projects flourished where isolation had once prevailed. Civilizations discovered that when guided by moral principle rather than fear of punishment, cooperation was stronger and more lasting. Humans also focused on education and the younger generation. They built schools and academies that taught not just science and technology, but ethics, empathy, and critical thinking. They encouraged students to solve problems through discussion, negotiation, and collaboration. The humans understood that the future of the galaxy depended on cultivating leaders who could act with conscience, not just power. Slowly, the universe began to change. It was no longer perfect, and it never would be. But it was stronger, wiser, and more connected. Humans had returned in a way that did not dominate, control, or enforce, yet their influence spread further than ever. The galaxy was learning that real power lies not in authority, but in guiding others to understand right from wrong and to act accordingly. The Council, too, was transformed. While humans did not resume their official seats immediately, their indirect influence changed the way decisions were made. Leaders hesitated before passing measures that might harm civilizations. They consulted with their citizens and considered morality alongside politics. In many ways, the return of humans had reminded the Council of its original purpose: to serve, not control, to guide, not dominate. Even in the smallest corners of the galaxy, humans left lasting marks. They helped stabilize resource distribution on struggling planets, supported the creation of community councils, and encouraged species to work together. Their quiet influence reached places the Council could not touch, inspiring hope where despair had settled. For humanity, the return was not about reclaiming glory or power. It was about reminding the universe of what it could achieve when guided by ethics and principle. The human delegation understood that leadership was not about command but about inspiration, support, and example. They showed that influence did not require domination but clarity of purpose and moral courage. The galaxy noticed. Species that had been skeptical of human ideals began to embrace them. Alliances formed based on mutual respect rather than fear. Conflicts that had seemed inevitable were resolved through dialogue. And everywhere, the memory of humanity's earlier departure served as a reminder that principle matters more than position. In the quiet of space, human ships traveled from system to system, unnoticed by many but profoundly felt by those they helped. They repaired infrastructure, shared knowledge, mediated local disputes, and nurtured communities. Their work was tireless, steady, and deliberate, and through it all they never sought recognition. Their satisfaction came from seeing others thrive and make wise choices. Slowly, the council itself began to invite humans back into discussion, not to reclaim authority but to seek their guidance. The humans returned with caution and humility, emphasizing collaboration, principle, and fairness. They did not demand obedience, but they shared insights that helped civilizations understand the consequences of their actions. The galaxy had learned its lessons. It understood that humans' departure had been a warning, and their return was a reminder of what the universe could achieve when guided by morality and conscience. Civilizations became more resilient, leaders more thoughtful, and citizens more engaged. Humans had shown that ethical influence, patience, and example could accomplish far more than control or force ever could. In the end, humanity's return was not about reclaiming power, but about shaping a future where conscience mattered. They had left to prove that principles could survive absence, and they returned to demonstrate that guidance, not domination, could transform civilizations. The universe had felt their absence and learned from it, and now it could see the results of their quiet, unwavering influence. The stars themselves seemed to shine differently as humanity moved through the galaxy, not brighter, but with a sense of purpose, of hope, and of moral clarity. Worlds learned to cooperate, leaders learned to act with conscience, and civilizations discovered that even the smallest species could make the largest difference. The return of the unseen reminded the galaxy of a simple truth. Real power is not in control, but in conscience. Leadership is not in command, but in guidance, and even the quietest, most patient actions can ripple across the universe in ways that shape history forever. Humanity had returned, not to rule, not to dominate, but to inspire.